further ado, I'm very excited to welcome the first MTS speaker, Dr. Carolyn Jennings. Dr. Jennings graduated with an undergraduate degree from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland in philosophy. She went on to get her PhD and MA at Boston University, and her PhD is in philosophy and her MA is in psychology. She followed that by doing postdoctoral research at Antwerp in Berlin, and then she came to join us as an assistant professor here at UC Merced. She's received multiple awards from APA to study academic placement data and analysis, which is a really exciting project. And today she's going to be telling us about her new book entitled The Attending Mind. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Carolyn.
Thanks so much, Lace. That's a great introduction. I'm going to stop admitting participants now. I wanted to start just by thanking Lace for setting up this MTS series. It's a lot of work, and we all appreciate the time that you're putting into making sure we're all entertained once a week for the whole term and not thinking about fires. So this is going to be a kind of overview of my new book. So I've been working on this book for a number of years. It's called The Attending Mind. It was published this spring with Cambridge University Press, and I'm excited to talk about it with you all. I'm going to be mostly giving you kind of overview, background assumptions, outline. I will go through one of the arguments that's in the book, the one that I suspect people will be the most interested in. I have talked about that argument one time in a CIS brown bag before, so some of you might be somewhat familiar with that argument already. Okay, so start out. I wanted to give you a little bit of the background, some background assumptions that I have in my research for people that don't know me or don't know my research that well. So this little diagram is by Owen Flanagan. Owen Flanagan created this for his own research, but it's actually this approximate method's been taken up in philosophy of mind in general. And it's a pretty simple representation of the way he thinks philosophy of mind should go. So he thinks philosophy of mind should integrate three types of evidence. Evidence from experience, which he calls phenomenology, evidence from behavior, as from psychology, and evidence from the brain, from neuroscience. And the reason that that's important that he put that idea forward, that all three should be integrated when considering phenomena that have to do with the mind, is because there has been a division between especially philosophy and phenomenology and psychology and neuroscience historically. So philosophers have tended to ignore the outcomes of the sciences, especially philosophers of mind, which is what we're talking about right now. They haven't really kept up with psychology and neuroscience. And on the other hand, there's been a kind of a sidelining of philosophy and the sciences of the mind. There's an idea that there's not much that they can add, that you can't just get straight from the experiments. And I think that that's changed in the last 20 years or so as everybody's into this interdisciplinary movement, and now both sides are kind of seeing that there's something of value they can't get on their own from the other disciplines. And that's what Owen Flanagan calls a natural method. That's the method that I use in my own work. I use evidence from phenomenology, evidence from psychology, and evidence from neuroscience, and trying to come up with theories that make the best sense of the evidence that we have, basically. I use that approximate method in one of my first papers called The Subject of Attention from 2012. In that paper, I argue, this is a little bit of a play on words because I argue that there is a self that directs attention, basically, which is the subject of attention, the thing that directs attention. So it's not just on the topic of attention, it's also about the subject of attention. And I argue that by using evidence from those three fields. It's also the method that's used by most people in philosophy of mind today. And I'm actually currently editing a volume called Mind, Cognition, and Neuroscience, A Philosophical Introduction. I'm editing that volume with someone else, Ben Young. And almost every chapter in that volume uses this approximate method. It uses evidence from these three domains. So it's the most widely used methodology. So to give you a little bit of a sense of like what phenomenology means in this context, I thought we could start with a little exercise. So, oh, sorry, let me go back. It's a responsive screen. Okay, there we go. So I thought we could start with a little exercise. For this exercise, I thought it would work best if everybody turned their mics off and their videos off so they don't feel weird and awkward. So please do that. I am a certified yoga teacher, but we're not going to be getting very far into yoga, don't worry. So what we're doing in the next couple of minutes is just going to be a couple of meditation exercises. So for these meditation exercises, I want you to be relaxed and to close your eyes. You don't have to do that yet, but that's why I wanted you to put your video off. So for this first meditation exercise, we're going to be doing something called focused meditation. And this is a form of meditation where you tend to focus on one thing, as it says, as the name indicates. So we'll do it just by focusing on our own breath. So what I want you to do for 1 minute, and I will time it, is I want you to pay attention to your own breath. That can be the physical sensation of breathing or the sound of your breath, either are fine. And I just want you to close your eyes and do that for 1 minute. So before you do that, take a deep breath in and out. All right, and I'll start the timer. So 1 minute feels really long when you just do one thing. It's one thing I often notice. Okay, so keep whatever your experience was, keep that in mind. And we're going to do another one of these exercises. We're going to be doing it with something called open monitoring meditation. So you'll turn off your mics and your cameras again, and it'll be 1 minute again. But this time, instead of focusing on one thing, in open monitoring meditation, what you try to do is you try to be aware of your environment around you in general. And if anything does grab your attention, like your breath or the sun or your heart beating or whatever, you try to just let it go after it grabs your attention. So you're trying to remain aware of everything happening around you in general, rather than focusing on any particular thing. Does that make sense? I guess you can't answer. So please, mics off, videos off, and you'll close your eyes again and do this for 1 minute, and then we'll have another kind of discussion of how that went for you. All right, deep breath in and out. And 1 minute of open monitoring meditation. Okay, that was 1 minute. Again, if you could turn your mics back on, your videos back on, I'd like to hear what that was like and how it differed, especially from focused meditation.
It was harder to maintain.
It was harder because
Yeah.
it's hard to let go of certain things.
By trying to focus on everything at the same time, you don't focus on other things. So while you're trying to get everything, there are things that you don't focus on, I guess.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it can be more forgiving depending on how you're contextualizing, getting distracted and then falling back into the normal mode.
It's kind of hard to know when you've stopped focusing on something that distracted you.
Oh, interesting. So it's hard to track your attention. Yeah, that sounds right. Anything else? We'll notice other things.
It felt a little bit more, and I don't know if this is the right word, but it's the word I'm going to use. It felt a little more frantic, because as my mind is attending to something and then I'm aware that I should let it go to attend to something else. There's the sound of the fan in my room, then let that go. Then now the sound of my breathing, now the feel of my shirt on my skin. So I don't know if frantic's the right word, but that's a kind of vibe I got from that one.
Yeah, I might have done a bad job of describing. I might have made you worry too much about the letting go part of it.
It wasn't like anxiety inducing at all.
Okay.
It wasn't as calming as the earlier one.
Yeah, I think it's considered to be a more advanced practice. Usually people have to start with the focused one and then move to the open monitoring one over time. Any other contrast that people noticed, difference across the two?
I found it more calming and even enjoyable, not because when I let go of one thing I was accidentally paying attention to too much, but rather I could hear this background noise and then let go enough to hear something else, and I heard another background noise, and it got to be like I was expanding my perceptual experience to include all of these things. And it was fun to realize, oh yes, I can hear that other background noise that I didn't know was there.
Yeah, cool. So all of these experiences are valid, of course, but what Michael just said is when I do this in the class that I teach, we often have like a section on meditation in my consciousness course, a class on meditation, and we'll often do this. That is the thing that I was going for, is the contrast of being aware of background sounds you hadn't heard during focused meditation. That's what a lot of my students report when we do this exercise. And there are many differences, but that's the one that I was interested in talking about a little bit, which is that I think many people have the experience that in focused meditation, they're so focused on their breath that they don't notice other things that are happening. And then when they move to open monitoring, then they're suddenly aware of more. Maybe the AC or the refrigerator hum, whatever, people report different things. But if you experience that, then that was what I was thinking of, although this exercise is probably helpful regardless. And that's because phenomenologists who've worked on attention have been interested in attention as a field and not just as operating over the target of attention. So sometimes people have talked about attention as though it only alters the target of attention, like the breath. All it does is highlight the breath to you. But even if you use the traditional spotlight metaphor and you think about how a spotlight works, if you go outside and it's dark outside and then you shine a light, it's not just that the light brightens whatever is in its path. It also makes everything else seem darker to you. You could probably see more before you lit the flashlight than after you lit the flashlight everywhere else, right? And similarly, attention does not just highlight the target of attention, it also seems like it operates on the surround. It also diminishes the impact of the surround on your experience. So when you have focused meditation, you highlight the breath, but at the expense of everything else. So that's something that I've been interested in my own work, is how attention operates as a field and not just at a point or not just on an object. And that's actually one of the most popular neural models of attention, has also taken this field approach. I think that's something you can see very quickly through this phenomenological technique, is how attention seems like it operates as a field and not just at a point. Okay, so that was just the context. I will, if we don't have time to get through the whole thing, that is totally fine with me. So don't be worried, I'm not. Obviously I am a little, but I'll try to go past the parts that are less important more quickly so we can talk about the more important parts with more time. Do feel free to interrupt with questions. And if I oh, I see that some people put stuff in the chat. I'm sorry, I guess I ignored it. If I don't respond to something in the chat and you think it would be helpful, just say it out loud orally. It's totally fine. Okay, that was the context of any questions so far? Any thoughts so far on what I said so far?
Do you have a YouTube page for your yoga classes?
I'm a certified yoga teacher, but I do not teach yoga.
Okay, that could be cool.
Yeah, maybe in the future. I'm a little busy right now with my main job, but maybe in the future. I'm, interested. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through the main topics of the book. So this is just like an outline of what happens in the book. And I'm going to talk about the arguments in one of these chapters in a little bit more detail. And I'll talk about some of my main claims in a little bit more detail. But this is just to give you a sense of like, what am I even doing in this book? So the first main chapter of the book is just a history of all of the philosophical research on attention for especially the last 500 years. That sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. I actually touch on stuff that's thousands of years old in that chapter, but I'm mostly focused on the last 500 years. So it's very dense, it's very fast. It covers a lot of ground because the whole point is just to give a landscape of everything that's been done so you can see what's out there on attention in philosophy. Here are some of the themes that come up. Before I talk about those themes, I'm going to do a quick poll. Yes, so I'm going to launch this poll. Please answer these 3 questions. It's not anonymous, but I'm not going to out anybody. So don't worry about your answers. Just answer however you feel in the moment. I'll just give you like another 30 seconds. Almost everyone has responded. I think I'll just end the poll. I'm seeing just a few people. Okay, so I'll share the results and I'll talk about these as I go through these main themes. So the main themes of historical philosophical research on attention are divided. I would divide them into 2 groups. What is attention and what does attention do, basically? And so one of the big things that philosophers ask is how do you separate attention from other forms of neural selection? So pretty much all philosophers on attention agree that attention is more than just selection. So you can see that seems like most people who answered the poll agree that it's not true that all forms of neural selection are attention. That is the standard position in the philosophy, and I would say also the science of attention. You do find some theorists who will just refer to any selection that happens in the brain as attention, but that's not the most standard way of talking about it. And that's because if you think of, for example, there's selection that occurs in your fovea, you could call that neural selection. So your fovea, cells in your fovea are selecting for, my chat actually closed down, so I can't see my chat anymore, sorry. The cells in the fovea select for specific wavelength segments of light, and where they're more selective to them, but we don't call that attention. And so how do you separate the form of selection that is attention from all these other forms of neural selection? What is special about attention that makes it distinct from these other forms? So a lot of work in the philosophy of attention is trying to figure that out, just like, what is it, basically? And that's kind of philosophy of everything. One of the first steps is, what is this thing? And then what does it do and how is it connected to other things? In the history of work on philosophy, the concept of attention has really changed. If you look at ancient philosophy from the Indian subcontinent thousands of years ago, there was a debate about whether attention was an instrument or a practice. And I really like that on question 2, it looks like it was pretty split. Some people say instrument and some people say practice. And that is how it was in Indian philosophy about 2,500 years ago. So you had some groups who said attention is a thing that you direct. That's like the instrument idea. And other people who said, no, attention is something that you do, but it's not a thing that you direct. It's a way you do things. So for example, if a monk wanted to learn from his teacher, there was a specific way of learning that would be attention. That would be the practice version. So in Indian philosophy, they had both of those concepts, the instrument and practice concept, thousands of years ago. In so-called Western philosophy, that is ancient Greek philosophy, and then medieval and Renaissance European philosophy, and now Anglophone philosophy, they only had the practice account until about 500 years ago. About 500 years ago, Descartes came up with the instrument account for Western philosophy. And ever since, the instrument account has been the dominant one for both philosophy of attention and actually in the sciences of attention. That's like the contemporary scientific concept, is that there's some kind of thing that's doing the attention stuff. But I think it's interesting that there are these differences from the past. Okay, and then another theme that comes up in the chapter is the approach of phenomenologists versus what I call skeptics about attention. So in the 20th century, there was a branch of philosophy called phenomenology, where people reflected on experience to try to see what experience could tell us about the mind and other things about the world. Phenomenologists thought attention was really important. But also at the beginning of the 20th century, you had a group of Anglophone philosophers, logical positivists, and a group of scientists, behaviorists, who both thought that attention wasn't something that we should be paying attention to. It wasn't something that we should be doing work on. And I call those the skeptics. So there were some people who thought attention was super important, some people who thought it wasn't important at all, and we should actually stop talking about it. And whereas in the sciences and the cognitive revolution, we started talking about attention again, in philosophy, it didn't really come back until about 10 years ago. So I talk a little bit about those two threads and how they ran in parallel. And then finally, in that first chapter, I talk about just like how historically people were mostly interested in attention and perception, and how those interests have changed later. So that last question I asked you in the poll, is attention a useful concept? I agree, so I'm glad that most of you agree. I'm glad nobody said no, but there are still some contemporary people who think that it is not a useful concept and we should stop talking about it, including philosophers. Okay, so yes, okay, I'm just going to do really a much quicker review of the other chapters so I can talk about one thing in detail, because I think it's kind of hard to hear all of these ideas at once. So I'll tell you about the next 4 chapters relatively quickly, a kind of like gloss view. The next 4 chapters, like my theoretical contributions to attention research, and they're each on a different contemporary theme. So the first one's on attention in the self, where I argue for the existence of a self. That's the one where I will talk about the argument in a little bit more detail. So I basically talk in that chapter about what's called the homunculus fallacy, this worry that any brain-based self will be a homunculus versus my account of an emergent self. I talk about the concept of what I call the illusion view, that both the self and mental causation are illusions. And I talk about bottom-up and top-down attention in the brain and weak and strong emergence, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. In the other chapters, I talk about attention and perception, attention and consciousness, and attention and action. And when I talk about attention and perception, you may be familiar with work that's been done on distinguishing perception from sensation using attention. So work, for example, on the binding problem by andthe. So andthe has argued in the past that attention was the key to forming perceptual objects out of sensations. I prefer to think in terms of what I call the combination problem instead of the binding problem. I think that that way of talking about it makes people think of there being little sensory bits that are glued together into objects using attention. And I like to think of it more like this combination lock approach. So a combination lock, like in the picture, works by turning the dial so that the wheels turn one at a time and the spindle falls into the wheel at the groove. So when you turn the dial the first time, it falls into the first groove, and then into the second one, and then into the third one, and then you're able to open the lock, right? So the way I think of this problem is that the organism is using some specified neural area or some neural system in order to lock onto an object in its spatial environment. So it's not that it's taking these pieces and gluing them together, but it's taking these tools and it's using them all at once to lock onto something, if that makes sense. I'm kind of using the term metaphorically there, but. So that's just a heads up that while I use that research and it sets up my own theoretical stance, that I differ in my approach to how we should think about the role of the brain in this problem. Treisman argued that attention was important for forming objects out of object parts. Merleau-Ponty had an even stronger view. Merleau-Ponty is a phenomenologist. He thought that all of our objective space depends on the role of attention. I think both of those are too strong of claims, that you can have objects, Treisman agrees with this too, but you can have objects without attention and you can have space without attention. And so I argue instead that what attention does is it separates foreground from background and it provides meaning to perception. And so that's one of my theoretical contributions. I've done it in articles as well, but in the book I talk about how attention provides meaning to sensation to make it perceptual. The next chapter, I talk about the relationship between attention and consciousness. So this has probably been the hottest topic in contemporary philosophy of attention. And I think that's because while after the cognitive revolution, attention became this big deal in psychology and neuroscience, nobody was discussing it in philosophy. And in philosophy, everyone was talking about consciousness, and no one was talking about consciousness in psychology and neuroscience pretty much until the last, like, let's say 20 years did consciousness come into the sciences. So once those fields started coming back together again with this new interdisciplinary trendiness, it makes sense that attention and consciousness would need to meet, and for those two fields to figure out how they're related to one another. Probably the most prominent view in consciousness theory is the global workspace theory. And in that theory, attention is necessary for consciousness. You don't become conscious of anything without attention. I am opposed to that idea. Other people in philosophy have been opposed to that idea too. There's a concept from philosophy, phenomenal consciousness versus axis consciousness. People who came up with that concept think that attention is only necessary for axis consciousness, but not phenomenal consciousness. I think that the arguments that those other philosophers have made aren't good enough. And so I make my own argument that I think is good enough to say that the workspace theory isn't correct. The workspace theory, one of the things that's distinct from my view and the global workspace theory is in the workspace theory, there is this metaphor of the theater. So you have, the way they think of consciousness is that there's like a self in the audience is the self in the theater. And it's kind of watching consciousness on a stage. And there may be actors in the back that sometimes come on stage and sometimes don't. And there's a spotlight picking out the spotlight of attention. That's the theater metaphor. I prefer what I call the performance hypothesis, which is instead of thinking of experience as something that you kind of like passively view from the audience of a theater, that you should see consciousness as more like performance art. So in performance art, and this is a picture from a piece by Marina Abramovich. Marina Abramovich is a really famous performance artist, and she, in this case, for example, she invited anyone who came to the museum to sit across from her. And the artwork is, in this case, created by the audience and the artist. So instead of the traditional form of art where you might just view a painting and you might see that as a passive process or a theater or whatever, in this case, you sitting in that chair is becoming part of the piece. And that is how, I think that twist is really important for thinking about consciousness. It's not, I do think that there is a self involved, but I don't think it's involved in this kind of passive, just viewing of consciousness kind of way. I think of it as the self creating consciousness with the world that it's in, and that the two are working together to create that thing. Okay, so that's that chapter. I use this different evidence to support the two different claims. Okay, final topic of the book is about whether action and responsibility can occur without attention, as in skill. I was hoping to get somebody to volunteer a skill that they have, they might be willing to talk a little bit about. Should we have questions about it? That's what that picture is for. Can you say it orally though, because my chat broke down, sorry. Anybody have a skill, something you're really good at?
Do oil paintings.
Oh, great. Who was that?
Daniel.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, sorry, for some reason, the heads don't pop up when they talk. Cool. Okay, so oil painting. So can you tell us just like a little bit about what it's like to oil paint?
It's in a lot of ways it's free form because like really there's nothing to guide you what you should or shouldn't paint, but it's also procedural. Like there are clear steps that you need to follow in order to be successful. So it's kind of balancing sort of this procedure of like, these are sort of the key components of what makes you successful at painting while also still being open to doing whatever it is that you want to create.
Cool. Can you give us an example of a procedural thing?
Yeah, just mixing the paints. Like if you're trying to create a color, there are specific ways that you need to go about making a color. You can't just throw any combination and get a good color. Okay.
So probably if you're a novice painter, you might have heard a technique like, okay, you want, when I was in art class as a kid, you need to mix blue and yellow to get green, like something that basic, right? So you might be like, okay, I want green, so I have to go get the blue and the yellow and I have to mix it together.
Right.
But maybe when you're an expert painter, would it be correct? Sorry, maybe experts too. I don't want to like put that on you, but like, when you're a more advanced painter, you might just like have the colors on a palette, and when you need to get green, you don't have to think, okay, I have to get the yellow and the blue, and I have to mix them to make it. Is that right?
Yeah, like the better that I've gotten at making colors, the more liberty you can take with the combinations that you make. Like, and there's like specific outcomes that that you can do. So it's like, it depends on like what kind of black are you trying to make? Are you trying to make one that is like ashy gray, or one where it stretches out and turns kind of like a weird emerald green? But both of which on the surface look the same. It's just they have these different features that you can also create, but the color combination is the same. It's blue and brown. It's the different kinds of like hues that can be added to make it different.
And you do that kind of like fluidly. It sounds like you sort of like on the spot will just look at it and just mix it, rather than using a rule that you've memorized or something.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's definitely conventions. As well.
Okay. Well, that's great. So in this chapter, I basically am talking about that kind of thing. Like when you go from a novice to expert, what happens exactly? In particular, what is the relationship between the automatic aspects of the behavior? So you tend to automatize certain things like the mixing of the yellow and the blue paint, whereas other things you might be using your attention for. And so I talk in that chapter about how those things compete. I talk about them under something I call the problem of skilled behavior, which is that on the one hand, our skills tend to be something we identify with. So Dan probably identifies with them as being a painter. That's an important part of him. And on the other hand, when you are skilled in something, there are certain ways in which that skill seems out of your control. So there's certain ways in which it seems like it proceeds on its own without you intentionally doing things. When you're learning something, you do everything really intentionally, really deliberately. But as you become more expert, you're doing things less deliberately, and it might seem to you like it's less within your control, or you're using less attention. That's a standard way of thinking about skill and habitual behavior. But yet, it's you even more identify with it than the things that you can do with lots of intention and lots of deliberation. I call it the problem of skilled behavior because in philosophy of action, for something to count as an action, in some accounts it has to be controlled, in other accounts it has to be deliberate. So how does skill fit in? Is it action or not? It kind of has some elements of both. and you see in philosophy fights about where it fits in. And so my solution to this problem is to say, actually, there are two forms of control. That there's one form of control, which is like your kind of deliberate control. And there's another form of control, which is strategic automaticity. And that's based in these automatic parts of us, but we are kind of directing them. And that has some impact for some debates on legal theory and stuff like that.
Hey, Carolyn, I had a question in the chat.
Yeah.
And I think that you can pull it up if you just drag your mouse up towards kind of like wherever the recording is. You should be able to pull the chat back down.
Yeah, I can, thank you.
Okay,
Like playing piano? Oh. Which question was the one you thought I should answer?
Does muscle memory have an attention component? From Caitlin.
Question.
Yeah.
So probably it depends on your theory of attention, but in mine, no. So like if your theory of attention is one in which like all really low level neural selection would count as attention, then it would probably. But muscle memory, I'm not exactly sure what neural phenomenon that picks out, but I'm guessing you're talking about something relatively low level. It doesn't require, like, for example, feedback from the prefrontal cortex. So it wouldn't count as attention in my view. But I haven't given you much reason to think that. This little picture was just, was that enough of an answer? Should I say more about that, Kaylee? Okay. This picture, I'm not going to talk about this in detail. I just wanted to remind myself to tell you that I'm actually working on some of these issues now with Alex Dyer. We're trying to develop how exactly attention and automaticity relate to each other. And so we have a paper where we argue that for something we call pluralism, where the two, where attention and automaticity basically play off each other in different ways. Okay, so I will talk about some of the main claims of the book. So there are 4 main claims of the book, each aligning with one of the different chapters. So one of the main claims of the book is that attention's evidence of an emergent self with its own causal powers. That's what I take to be the most controversial one for this group anyhow. To give you a little bit of a sense of what I mean by that, I'm thinking of the self as the set of our interests. So if you have interests in, say, cognitive science and painting, and well, let's just go cognitive science and painting, those two interests can come into conflict for certain, like for resources, for example. So it may be that you have both a painting that you really want to work on and a paper you really want to work on, and the two interests are coming into conflict. So they're going to have to compete with one another for resources. And what I think of as the self is the propensity to resolve that conflict in a certain way. So it's a physical thing, I think, but it's the set, I think of it as a set of all interests, and then that set goes beyond just the addition of the individual interests, because the set will develop propensities to respond in certain ways to the environment. So I like to think of starling murmurations as kind of inspiration for this view. So like the starling murmurations work as a set to respond to their environment, in part because of pre-code things in their genetic code that help them to respond to predators in specific ways. I think that our interests, not in a pre-coded way, but that they work together in a certain way to respond to these conflicts. So I argue for the existence of a self. I argue it is the set of our interests, that it is something that happens in the brain. I argue for attention as being necessary for perception and for perceptual knowledge. So if you remember back to focusing on your breath, when you were focusing on your breath was in the foreground of your experience against the background of your experience. But when you had open monitoring meditation, it probably lost that foreground background structure at least some of the time while you were doing open monitoring meditations. At least some of the time it was probably the case that things were more evenly weighted across your experience. That foreground background structure is what I think attention provides. I think it's the most basic structure in perceptual experience. So the other structures, objects, space, whatever, I think those are more complicated structures. And the most basic, most fundamental structure is this foreground background one. And that without that, it wouldn't be perception at all. So those are the two main positive claims of the book. It's attention's evidence of a self, and that's the only way we get perception. And we get it because attention segments sensation into foreground and background. What is currently most important to you and everything else. And then in contrast, what is attention not important for? I think it's not necessary for consciousness. I think that we have to rethink the way we talk about consciousness, because I think that it's clear that we're conscious when we do very habitual behaviors, when we paint, when we do other skill behaviors, even when, if we pay attention to the science of habitual behavior, we would normally argue that you're not using attention. And I also think that attention is not necessary for action, and that will force us to rethink traditional theories of action and responsibility. This is a picture of an fMRI machine with a metal chair in it because somebody brought a metal chair into the room in which there was an fMRI machine. And this would be a case of negligence because somebody would die. That happened while there was someone in the scanner. And negligence is a theory of a legal concept that I think is very intuitive, but legal theorists have had a hard time explaining, because it's a case in which you're acting and you're responsible for something, even though you, by definition, weren't conscious of it, you weren't attending to it. And that frustrates legal theorists because they don't know how to explain the fact that intuitively you are responsible for bringing the chair into the room, even if you did it without attending to that and without being aware that you were doing that. What I argue is that that negligence comes from this secondary form of control, not from the deliberate form of control, but from the form of control where we say that you're responsible for the skills that you have. We feel responsible for the skills we have. We feel like they define us. We are painters. We are cognitive scientists. That's who we are. And so if we can get praised for those things, if we expect to be praised for having those skills, then it also makes sense on the reverse side that we could be blamed for them when they go wrong, I think. So even when they're not deliberate, even when they're not conscious, that when you have a bad skill, that you could be responsible for that. And I think that that explains negligence better than some of the other legal theories. Okay, those are the main claims of the book. I'm going to try to talk quickly through one of the main arguments that I give in the book for the first of those claims. The idea that there is a sense of self, and you're going to hear about the no self view that I see in the chat. So there's going to be like a positive and negative. So that's like some evidence in favor of the self and evidence against the self. In favor of the idea that there could be a self-directing attention is the phenomenology of effort. So attention comes in many forms, but two of the forms are effortful and effortless, voluntary, involuntary, top-down, bottom-up, however you want to name them. In one form, you direct your attention with effort, and in another form, your attention is grabbed effortlessly. The fact that those feel different to you make it seem like you're directing attention. Why is it hard to direct attention sometimes? Because you're doing something out of a pool of limited resources is like a typical explanation. If you're not doing it, if you're passive, then it doesn't take any effort, and that's why it doesn't feel effortful. This is this idea that there's a split in the types of attention, and that one of the forms of attention seems like it requires a self. That's a really old idea, but we're starting at the beginning here with the phenomenology of effort. It seems like you're directing attention sometimes and not others. So it seems like there's a self that directs attention. In contrast is what I call the illusion view, this idea of anatta, or no self. This is discussed, for example, in Janardhan Ganeri's recent book, which is called Attention, Not Self. You could practically rename my book Attention Self, and we'd be like, you know, like opposed to one another. But Janardhan's super nice, and he thinks we have the same view, so I don't know how that works. So anatta is the claim, or anatta is the claim that there's no room for something real at the center doing the observing or ordering. So in Buddhist philosophy, and these ideas have been around for thousands of years, even though it seems like there's a self-directing attention, there is nothing directing attention. That's an illusion. One of the old responses to that is then, how can the illusion theorists explain the sense of effort? That is, why do we have the sense of effort at all if it's an illusion? So often with illusions, we can explain, if we're thinking in evolutionary terms, of why we have that illusion. There's some other thing that the illusion, the thing that provides the illusion, there's some benefit we're getting from that thing. And that's why we have the illusion. Some kind of constancy or something like that. What is it that effort is doing for us if there is no self? Like what is the role the illusion theorist thinks that is doing for us? Back on the positive side, there are behavioral neural signatures of top-down attention. So it's not just that it feels effortful, but there's a distinction in behavior and in the brain between the two types. When attention's grabbed versus when it's directed, they behave differently in the brain and in behavior. So it's not just that it seems like they're distinct, they are distinguishable in the natural world. So for example, top-down attention is slower than bottom-up attention because it operates via feedback from the areas of the brain that are further away from the primary sensory and motor areas, using cortical layers that are deeper than those filtering incoming stimuli. Usually this is seen as a disadvantage, like top-down attention is slow and bad, bottom-up attention is good and fast. But one of the things that I do in this chapter is argue that this slowness is the thing that gives attention its power, the top-down attention its power. And I'll explain that in a minute. Okay, so the emergence view is a way of explaining the fact that it seems like not just that there's an effort, a sense of effort within phenomenology, but it seems like there's a separability between top-down and bottom-up attention. The emergence view, which you could give to Desmond and Duncan, but again, this is actually something like this view is as old as Buddhist philosophy. In this view, it seems like there's a distinction between these two types of attention, but this is the appearance of emergence. So basically, you have local interactions between neurons that are competing for resources, and those can lead to bottom-up attention if there's a strong enough signal, or if there's a delay and if we wait long enough for the slower competitive interactions to work that take more time, then you will see what appears to be a different type of thing happening. But it's just because you've waited longer, basically. It's just the appearance of a different phenomenon, but it's really the same underlying processes in both cases. While I agree with this idea that we should see top-down attention as something that occurs through emergence, I disagree that we should think of it just as the appearance of emergence. And so what I do in that chapter is I argue that there's evidence that it's not just what they call a weak emergence, something that appears emergent, but that it's a stronger form of emergence, a case in which this emergent property has some form of causal power. And I argue that based on this evidence about scale-free relationships in the brain, that there's a relationship between amplitude and frequency in brain and behavior is very well established. Many people in our group work on this, but because of that relationship, slower events, things that rely on lower frequency oscillations, have higher amplitude typically. And so higher frequency events, like what direct bottom-up attention, tend to be modulated by these slower frequency events. Because of the difference in amplitude, the smaller amplitude waves, oscillations are swamped by the higher amplitude, slower waves. I can talk about that more, but I'm running out of time. So a concern you could have is that, okay, so you think, Carolyn, that it's, the phenomenology, the behavior, and the neural evidence line up to the existence of a self directing attention. And this is like an emergent self in the brain that uses scale-free relationships to make one interest dominate over others or something like that. If that's right, then that violates the causal closure of the physical and all of science dies. Because we need the causal closure of the physical for all the other sciences to work. And there's a philosopher who argued for this point basically in 2005, not against me, but just against the possibility of this kind of approach in general. And I'm not going to say how it does it right now, but I'm happy to talk about this with people. But basically, this view does not need to violate the causal closure of the physical. If you have, you could have universal causal closure and have local violation of causal closure. And that depends on something called contextual emergence, which Daniel turned me on to in the work of Harold Oppensbacher. Okay, what's next? These are just projects that I'm working on now and in the future. I've been working with Shadi for years now on attention altered states and creativity. I'm working with Alex on attention mind wandering and skilled behavior. I'm writing a new manuscript on mental control with Cambridge University Press that's due in the spring. And I'm working on attention and technology for a chapter, attention and knowledge for a chapter, and for a conference, and attention and the law, kind of taking a lot of these different ideas and applying them to different domains. And I'm hoping to write another book in the future. On Twitter, I have this like jokey little post where people were comparing book covers to Taylor Swift outfits. And I think this book kind of looks like her outfit on the left, but I'm hoping my next book is going to be on attention and power, and it's going to look like the outfit on the right. So that's my plan. I have not written a thing about this book, but I'm really interested in how attention is used in different social structures, so that form of power. And so that's something I would like to work on in the future. And so I'm going to go into a lot more detail, just kidding. That was it for the talk. Thank you so much for bearing with me on that extremely fast roller coaster view of the book. And I would love to hear your questions. I'm sorry I haven't really been paying attention to the chat, even though I said I would. But please raise anything that came up there in Q&A.